Good afternoon. I'm sure you're thinking in your head right now, why in the world is Mrs. Lloyd wearing glasses? I usually almost always wear my contacts during the day and only wear my glasses like at night before I go to bed or earlier in the morning before I put my contacts in. But I don't know if it's my allergies bothering me a little bit. My eyes are really dry and kind of bugging me today. So took my contacts out, have my glasses on. So not something you see very often, but you may see it in a few videos from home. Anyway, I'm back with our book, our read aloud book, Escaping the Nazis on the Kindertransport. We are on chapter 5. And this chapter is called The Importance of a Rabbit's Foot. And the child's name is Irene Schmid. And at the very beginning of the chapter, there is a photograph. The caption says, Liverpool Station, London, 1928. 10 years later, this is the station that children would come into on the Kindertransport trains. So this is the train station in London where they would arrive. All those children would be shipped by train to London. All right. It says, Irene was leaving home. It was January 19th, 1939, and she was 10 years old. The night before, she had run from room to room in her Berlin house, saying goodbye to each room, touching the walls, telling the house she would never forget it if she didn't come back. No one knew if she would return. Irene joined a group of other children, all destined for the Kindertransport. They traveled to Hamburg, Germany. They were given lunch at a Jewish school. Irene had cocoa. It was delicious. Then the children boarded a bus to drive through Hamburg to the port. There, a ship would take them into their future. Irene had her doll, Peterchen. She had her memories. She had a suitcase. That was all she had, except hope. As she wrote later, I glued my nose against the window and watched the walls of buildings along the street go by and the electrical trolleys glide past on their snow-covered tracks. Their bells tinkled whenever they stopped to let off people. I turned to Marianne, the girl next to me. Did she have any idea where the bus was taking us? To keep the thoughts about my parents at bay, I tried to ask why her father had not been at the station that morning. The right words would not come. Your Poppy, I stuttered. Is he at home? He no longer lives, she said, and she began pulling, almost tearing at the identification tag hanging around her. Even as I heard those words, so unfathomable to me then, there was a vague understanding of them deep within me. Years later, when we came across one another as adults in New York, Marianne would tell me of the shot that had rung out one evening shortly before New Year in 1939. The Gestapo had come back to fetch her father, even though he had only just been released. His head shorn, his face gaunt, his eyes circled with pain. Detained on Kristallnacht, he had spent a month in a concentration camp near Berlin. Then he heard them pounding at the front door again. He could bear it no more and had raised his gun to his temple. In the bus that evening, I could find nothing to say to her. The words echoed almost meaninglessly in my mind. I forced myself to look out of the window at the street outside. The row of shops along it sent its yellow light out into the dusky air and onto the snow-swept sidewalks. On this, as on any other late January evening, people stopped to point at the winter sales displayed in the windows. Did they know what was happening? Finally, the bus stopped in front of a long, low brick building. Brown-shirted border guards stood at the entrances. The light streaming out of the barred windows hit my face. It sharpened the pain above my left eye. The rabbit charm in my pocket, a gift from my grandmother, began to tingle between my fingertips. Leaving the bus, I pushed myself forward to keep up with the others. Instructions blared over the loudspeaker, and innumerable lamp bulbs on the long stretch of low white ceiling blazed down. My suitcase grew heavier as I inched my way toward the rows of officials seated behind long wooden tables. The voices, the rustling of paper, the smell of dust and perspiration were dizzying. The glare of the lights hit my forehead and prevented me from keeping up with Lottie, the social worker in charge, and the other children. Leaning against a nearby doorway, I waited for the pounding in my forehead to pass. Opening my eyes again, I stepped into another place in the file. It was not the same line. A group of middle-aged couples surrounded me. Where had the other children gone? Alarmed, I thought of my parents. Would they be here? Were they still at home? I must find a telephone to call them, make sure that they were all right. The image of Marianne's father hit my mind. The gruff voice of the official at the table jolted me back. What is this child doing here? The people in line turned to stare. I felt hedged in by a circle of questioning, anxious faces. They were all strangers. The official turned to an assistant. I heard him say, Get this child out of the way. The pain in my head seemed to burst. I took the rabbit charm out of my pocket and I squeezed it for comfort. It was turning into a pulsating lump. The two customs officials were staring right at it. A heavy tap on my shoulder sent a quiver through me, and the rabbit plummeted to the floor. Not daring to pick it up, I turned my head and found myself staring at the yellow scarf around Lottie's neck. She seemed ready to slap me, but instead she shook me by the shoulders. Come on, you should be over there with all the others on the Kindertransport line. I held back and stooped to search for the little rabbit. I could not just abandon it amidst the dust, scraps of paper, and cigarette ends that littered the floor. It was Lottie who saw its glimmer, scooped it up, and handed it back to me, saying, Come on now, put away that silly little trinket. Let's go. The rabbit in my hand once more, I saw how tiny it really had been all the time. I stowed it in my coat pocket, knowing that it was safe now. Taking Lottie's hand, I followed her into the right line. The smell of the sea drifted towards us as we threaded our way through the crowd. In front of us, a wall of lighted portholes of the vessel stretched into the dark sky. I drew back. It seemed as if a row of huge Berlin apartment houses had floated down the river in pursuit. Or was this still Berlin? Had I never left? Willing them to turn back into the shining portholes of the steamer, I stared hard at the cold, bright lights. Then I grasped the railing and let the gangway pull me up into the ship. And that's the end of that chapter. So I will see you when we're back with chapter 6. See ya.